Have you ever heard someone use the expression, "Back in my day, we weren't so easily offended"? Well, to those individuals, I say this to you respectfully.
That is grade A 100% bull cookies.
Like many of you, I was around back in their day when it was an oh so tolerant live and let live attitude among everything, especially entertainment. Now these days, while the plot lines and language of most television entertainment, especially reality shows, rely on controversy, audiences are far too jaded to raise an eyebrow at salacious content. While performers, who often rely heavily on Botox and plastic surgery, can't raise an eyebrow anyway. Movies and television was very different in the 50s and 60s. Although there were plenty of comedies on TV, many were amusing, but most were really not very funny, and that was no accident. Of course, there were classics such as I Love Lucy, which had some timeless scenes still hilarious to this day, but most comedy of that era was quite bland, even with a laugh track. Tony Dow of Leave It to Beaver said, "If any line got too much of a laugh, they'd take it out. They didn't want laughs, they just wanted chuckles." This was typical of shows like that, which avoided pushing the envelope.
Hope you weren't too hard on the beaver.
No, not at all.
Somehow that escaped the Hays Code. Now, if you never heard of it, the Hays Code was a set of rules governing filmmaking beginning in the 1930s that clamped down on what was considered indecency in motion pictures and later television. This code lasted until 1968, until the Motion Picture Association adopted their own rating system. That was also the year, coincidentally, that Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In first appeared on television.
Alan Sues and Lily Tomlin.
Sock it to me?
You have not lived until you experienced the madcap comedy of that guy named Milhouse. Shows such as Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In and the Smothers Brothers paved the way for more topical, relevant, and controversial humor, which morphed into some highly scandalous and classic shows. And the more outraged and vocal people were about this, the more successful some of those programs were. And before we begin, here's a trivia question. In the 70s, what was the first network TV show to feature a gay character as a regular? We'll share the answer as we look at my list of the most controversial sitcoms of the 70s. Although it only lasted 13 episodes, this 1975 Norman Lear comedy created a storm for its eclectic ensemble of characters. Based on the successful Broadway play, the residents of the Hotel Baltimore, which had the E in hotel burned out, included an elderly woman with a never-seen psychotic son, a runaway tomboy, a pair of prostitutes, one of whom was an illegal alien, and the show also featured a gay couple as regulars, a first on a network TV show. Because of the subject matter, this was the first ABC show to have a warning at its opening, cautioning viewers about mature themes.
From Norman Lear, Hotel Baltimore, creator of All in the Family, Sanford and Son, another comedy milestone.
You cheat! Why would I cheat, you abominable old wretch? Because you are black!
What did you say?
I said you are black! I'm red! You go the wrong jacket!
Right, Hotel Baltimore.
Conchata Ferrell, who played April, one of the prostitutes, was the only one to reprise her role from the Broadway stage. Even though Hot L was not a big hit, Ferrell parlayed that role to over 130 film and TV credits, including Emmy nominations for L.A. Law and 2.5 Men. Charlotte Rae, in her pre-Mrs. Garrett days, was 49 at the time she auditioned for Mrs. Bellotti, but initially didn't get the part. She spoke of how disappointed she was at the time.
Rod Parker said, "No, you're too young." I said, "But I can put on old, I'm a character actor. I always do old ladies and stuff." No, this is television. It won't work. It won't wash." And I went home and I cried and I cried and I cried. And a girlfriend of mine said, don't worry about it. God's got something better for you. And what do you know? A couple of weeks later, I got a call from the show. They wanted to play a bit part, just a one shot. And I was at the table reading, and Norman Lear was there. Mrs. Bellotti with her son Moose. And he just loved the way I did it. And he said, I think we're going to put you on a little more often. And I ended up being a regular, which was wonderful.
Hot L Baltimore's brief foray also included Al Freeman Jr., Richard Masur, and Gloria Leroy, all of whom appeared in other Norman Lear productions, as well as James Cromwell, who you may recall as Stretch Cunningham. As I mentioned, this was a rare miss for Norman Lear, who at the time had been writing a string of hits. We would have others. Hey, do you remember the 4 women of history mentioned by singer Donny Hathaway, other than Maude herself, in the opening theme song? If you don't know, I'll have that answer shortly. As for Maude herself, you either loved her or hated her, and amazingly, there were those that hated her, especially after an episode where she gets an abortion. But for most viewers, the All in the Family spinoff was a knockout hit. And it was only through Norman Lear's insistence that she even made the guest appearance on All in the Family. When B. Arthur made that stunning cameo, William S. Paley, president of CBS, called up Norman Lear immediately that night and said, "Get that girl her own show." When they spun off Maude, the ratings went through the roof. But the outspoken liberal feminist housewife in suburbia was bound to have detractors in the Nixon era. Despite causing a stir at the time, the show made household names out of co-stars Rue McClanahan, who would later team up with Arthur in The Golden Girls, as well as Conrad Bain, who before the series even ended was signed on by producers to be the dad in Different Strokes, and Adrienne Barbeau. There was no official word if Adrienne suffered any on-set injuries, but if you look closely from the first to the later episode, you would definitely see a significant amount of swelling. It of course didn't hurt the sale of her posters. Another breakout star was Esther Roll, who was also primarily a stage actress and played Florida the maid.
Florida, this officer has been trying to accuse me of speeding in my own neighborhood. Now, you have driven with me 1,000 times, Florida. You know I do not speed. Now, will you tell him?
Lady, I ain't never seen you before in my life.
God will get you for that, Florida.
The daughter of Bahamian immigrants proved to be such a popular character that she got her own series, Good Times. After 6 seasons of being Maude, the good times were starting to wane. As B. Arthur stated, "We just ran out of controversy." In the final episodes, Maude becomes a congresswoman, cementing her place in history. And speaking of history, the 4 women mentioned in the opening theme are Lady Godiva, Joan of Arc, Isadora, Duncan that is, and Betsy Ross. Oh, and then there's Maude. You don't have to knock on many doors these days to find an episode of Three's Company airing somewhere in syndication. And if you weren't around in the mid-70s amid all the uproar surrounding the launch of the show, watching it you'd wonder what all the fuss was about. The shocking premise, based on a British sitcom Man About the House, was that Jack Tripper, a single man, moves into an apartment with 2 single women. His uptight landlord would not hear of such an abomination until he is told that Jack is gay, which is untrue, and he spends the rest of the series trying to hide the fact that he's straight. The entire series was based on physical comedy expertly maneuvered by John Ritter and innuendos. In fact, after the initial shock about the living arrangement wore off, the main controversial elements had to do with the sexual misunderstandings.
Okay, Chrissy, I'll get in the tub with you, then we can get it on.
Next to me, I'll show you
first time I've ever done this.
Maybe so, but girls are better at this than boys.
Come on, Chrissy, a little less talk and a little more action, okay?
Okay, you do your part, I'll do mine. I don't think it'll reach.
Of course not. You've got to unfold it first.
The show's new controversy took place in 1980, 3 years after it first aired. Suzanne Summers asked for more money. When the producer said no, she started to conveniently call in sick and was later fired. But not before the network decided to make an example of her by banning her from the set and having her call in her part. All of this created tension between Summers and her co-stars, resulting in Joyce DeWitt and John Ritter not speaking to Suzanne for decades. Eventually, Chrissy was replaced by her cousin Cindy, played by Jenna Lee Harrison, but producers weren't entirely pleased with her either, and she was replaced by Priscilla Barnes, who was a nurse named Terry. Sadly, John Ritter died in 2003. But not before he tracked Suzanne Summers down, and the two had a chance to patch things up between them. Suzanne also mended her feud of over 30 years with Joyce DeWitt, in part due to Ritter's passing. By the way, that also catchy theme song was sung by Julia Rinker and Ray Charles. No, not that Ray Charles. The Three's Company singer, born Charles Raymond Offenberg, is often referred to as the other Ray Charles, for which he always got a big kick out of. Once upon a time in Harlem, a young street hustler named Chicago Red met another street hustler named Detroit Red when they both worked in a place called Jimmy's Chicken Shack. The two became good friends and both would make their names known internationally. Detroit Red, or Malcolm Little, became Malcolm X, while Chicago Red, born John Elroy Sanford, was later known as Red Fox. Fast forward to 1972 when the world would know him as Fred Sanford on the NBC hit Sanford and Son. Now, if you know Red Fox's history, you might think that he was as unlikely to be cast on primetime TV as William Shatner was to be a rapper. But both happened. Norman Lear, who was already writing tremendous success with All in the Family, adopted the concept from a British sitcom called Steptoe and Son. As you would imagine, NBC executives were not too keen on casting Fox, or really black characters, for the show at all. They felt that black characters would not work for the show. A test screening was held with Paul Sorvino and Bernard Hughes, but the scene did not work. So Lear used another test audience comprised of All in the Family fans using Red Fox, and the audience went wild. According to producer Aaron Rubin, the gag that eventually sold the show was Fred's fake heart attacks. This became a staple in the show itself. This also helped to prove that a black cast could lead the show. Red Fox would play the mid-60s retiree even though he was still in his 40s at the show's beginning. Not everyone was sold on Sanford and Son even after it became a runaway hit. Many parents refused to let their kids watch the show because of Red Fox's comic past with plenty of blue humor. In addition to his risque nightclub act, Red had recorded several party records. These records were not for the faint of heart, although it did teach an entire generation how important it was to wash certain body parts. Fox never shied away from his past and often crossed the line in his dialogue.
Listen, why don't you arrest some white drivers?
I do.
You do? Well, where are they? Look at all these niggas in here. Look around here. There's enough niggas in here to make a Tarzan movie.
Red Fox had many failings, and among those was his generosity and his loyalty to friends. He saw to it that many of his friends from his nightclub days would be cast in the series. He and comic Slappy White opened for blues singer Dinah Washington in the early 50s, and Slappy had a recurring role as Melvin. The same was true for comics Skillet and Leroy, and Fred's favorite foil, LaWanda Page, who played Aunt Esther.
There's a whole story in the Bible all about me.
Oh, yeah, I remember now.
Samson slew the Philistine with your jawbone.
Some of the interactions between Fred and Esther were timeless classics, and interestingly, the network did not want her cast because of her lack of on-air experience. Red Fox, who had been friends with her since childhood, threatened to quit if she didn't stay. She stayed. Or just to dispel a rumor, Paige had a sister named Lynn Hamilton, but it was not the same Lynn Hamilton that would become Fred's girlfriend, Donna.
My sister had class. Our whole family's got class.
Before her recurring role as Donna, that Lynn Hamilton had a guest spot as the not-so-nice landlady when Lamont moved out. Lamont was played by Damon Wilson, but he was not the network's first choice for the role. They wanted Cleavon Little, who would later gain fame in Blazing Saddles. Interestingly, before Sanford and Son, both Damon Wilson and Cleavon Little played two robbers who break into the bunker house in an episode of All in the Family. The episode was entitled Edith Writes a Song, and after helping themselves to a few items in the house, the two were going to take the money Edith was planning on using to launch her singing career, but after hearing a sample of Edith's singing, they decided she needed the money much more than they did. I mentioned Red Fox's failings, and among those was his generosity. In fact, Red would lend or give money to people in need or his friends to the point that it made him destitute. His response was to go to NBC and demand more money for his show. This led to him walking out once for the rest of the seasons due to contract negotiations. Stepping in was Whitman Mayo, who played Grady. Interestingly, those shows were the highest ranked of the season. In a tragic bit of irony, the same routine that won Red Fox's most famous role may have cost him his life. One of the more popular bits on the show was Fred faking a heart attack when he didn't get his way. Even after the show ended, he would do this while kidding around with his friends. And in 1991, while on the set of his new show, The Royal Family, he went into the heart attack routine, but this time he was not joking. Everyone thought he was, and there was time wasted while they tried to get him to stop playing around. By the time they realized that this was the real deal, it was too late. The legendary comic, who would often play roles far older than he was, died at age 68. Before we get to our number one most controversial sitcom from the 70s, here are some honorable mentions. The Richard Pryor Show would have made the list except for the fact that Pryor's profound and profane humor was simply not made for TV, and most of what he wanted to do was quashed by the censors before it even aired. His show also only lasted 6 episodes. However, in that short time, he introduced the world to some really extraordinary talent, including Edie McClure, Tim Reed, Marsha Warfield, Sandra Bernhard, and an unknown comedian named Robin Williams. Saturday Night Live was not technically a sitcom, but since its launch in 1975, its impact on TV humor and TV in general is undeniable. It also ruffled more than a few feathers. With more cast members attaining superstardom than one can count, the show's sketches always included far more misses than hits, but the hits were oh so memorable. Fortunately, because of its late weekend time slot, those who were most likely to complain were already asleep.
Jane, you ignorant slut.
Soap, like Three's Company, generated an incredible amount of condemnation before it even began. Intended to be a satire of your typical soap opera storylines, the characters and plots were nothing like what you'd see on daytime TV. So you had to love it when Bert thought he could make himself invisible.
Bert, you cannot make yourself invisible.
No?
No.
All right. Watch.
Soap's biggest controversy came from the gay character Jody, played by Billy Crystal. Not just from conservative corners, but also from gay rights activists who felt that he perpetuated gay stereotypes. And to answer that trivia question, who was the first gay character to be on a regular network TV series? No, it wasn't Jody on Soap. Nor was it the aforementioned couple on Hot L Baltimore, although they were the first couple depicted. The first character was on a 1972 short-lived sitcom called The Corner Bar. This show starred Gabriel Dale as the bar owner, and it included a flamboyant character named Peter Panama, played by Vincent Schiavelli. And now, our number one most controversial sitcom of the 1970s.
Boy, the way Glenn Miller played.
Songs that made the hit parade.
If there was any one TV program that defined the leap into relevant, hot-button television for which the 70s became known, it was All in the Family. From the opening credits, when you hear laughter at Edith hitting the high notes, you knew this was going to be different. Can you even imagine Norman Lear pitching this today? The show definitely was unlike anything that preceded it, and the controversy ensued when not everyone got that the show was an ironic, satirical expose of a small-minded, ignorant bigot who genuinely felt that he was superior to others. The show broke ground in its depiction of issues previously considered unsuitable for a U.S. TV network comedy, such as racism, anti-Semitism, infidelity, women's liberation, rape, religion, miscarriages, abortion, breast cancer, the Vietnam War, menopause, and impotence.
Tell her. I will not. All right, then you tell her that. You do that pretty good.
I won't go to my mother.
Why the hell not? You go to your father every chance you get.
I only go to you when you go to me.
Well, get a whole damn bunch. I'm glad to see that little Joey agrees with me.
Carol O'Connor won 5 Emmys and 2 Golden Globes for his portrayal of Archie Bunker, who feared the changing world around him. However, O'Connor was not Norman Lear's first choice for the role. Lear wanted Mickey Rooney, but Rooney declined the offer because of the strong potential for controversy, and, in Rooney's opinion, the show had a poor chance for success.
You big dummy.
The other characters included the sweet and long-suffering dingbat wife of Archie, Edith Bunker. Jean Stapleton won 3 Emmys and 2 Golden Globes herself for that role. And of course, there was Gloria and Mike, Meathead, to round out the family. Their neighbors George and Wheezy were played by Sherman Hemsley and Isabel Sanford, and they eventually moved on up to their own successful spinoff that lasted 10 years. By the way, did you ever wonder why George was often referred to but never seen until 2 years after the Jeffersons moved in? At the time, Sherman Hemsley was touring with the musical Pearlie, but Norman Lear wanted him and only him and was willing to wait the 2 years until his commitment was up. Quite unusual in TV circles. Even more unusual was the fact that it was for an actor who had never been on television. All in the Family was Sherman Hemsley's TV debut. All in the Family boldly dared to go where few shows had gone before, including Archie being involved in only the second primetime interracial kiss. Director John Rich talks about that scene.
When we read the text the first time around the table, it had a very weak finish. The finish was that a neighbor came from next door and wanted to take a picture. And Archie said, no pictures. And Sammy said, no, I want a picture with you and me together. I want to remember this day, or whatever that was. And they took the picture. And then he said, goodbye. And so we had the usual 5-minute break for coffee, and I took Norman aside. I said, Norman, there's no finish. I said, it's weak. He said, well, yeah, it is. Well, we'll work on it. I said, yeah, there's something bugging. No, it's got to be much stronger. I started to laugh. He said, what? I said, I have an idea. He said, what? I said, I want Sammy to kiss Archie. He said, you're kidding. Yeah, dangerous idea, I guess. I don't know. I started to laugh. I said, I think that's a how. To think of Bunker's reaction.
Now on 3, okay? 1, 2, 3.
By the time the 70s began to wind down, so did the bite of many of the groundbreaking shows from that era. Even All in the Family morphed into the much tamer Archie Bunker's Place. And with few notable exceptions, the 80s brought in a new blandness to situation comedy. For this, we can only turn to the big network executives and say,
You big dummy!